All right, something else you want to keep in mind is, does the book that you're reading have footnotes, endnotes, a bibliography, or a works cited page? So I just named 4 different things, but they're getting at the same sort of idea. Footnotes are when, let me see if this one has footnotes. Yeah. So if you're looking for footnotes, then you're reading a book, and then at the bottom, it'll have a bunch of information that's in smaller print. That's called a footnote. So you might be reading in the book and there's a little number at the top of something in some sentence, and then you drop down, you find that number, and it's a footnote. And so if it has footnotes, then the author is telling you where they got their information. In the handouts that I give when I teach classes in prison, I always have footnotes because I don't want people to get the impression that I'm just so smart. I just write stuff that's brilliant. No, I'm relying on other people's information to help me understand and teach. And so books that have footnotes are important for that reason. So you can understand where this author got his information. Sometimes a book doesn't have footnotes, it has endnotes. And all that means is that it's basically the same information, but they just put it at the end of the chapter. So look at a book you're reading, open it up, and if it has notes at the bottom, those are called footnotes. Sometimes they don't. You have to go to the end of the chapter, and that's where they list all of the notes, and those are called endnotes. In any case, a footnote and an endnote is letting you, the reader, know where the author got their information from. It's similar if you go to the very back of a book. So this one is on Plato by Andrew Mason. It's published by the University of California Press at Berkeley. And if you go to the back of the book, it's got a list of all the works that were used to write this book. So these are kind of like endnotes. But it also lists all the books and information that this author used to write this book. And then it has a whole section on further reading. And then sometimes it might have a section called Works Cited, which just means those are all the works that were included. So a bibliography will be at the end of a book, and it's going to discuss all of the sources that were used to write that book. It's really important that you're able to find a bibliography or works cited in the back of the book, or footnotes at the bottom of the page, or endnotes at the end of the chapter, because if an author doesn't provide that, then you have no way of knowing whether the author is actually giving you well-researched, legitimate, and credible information. If they don't have any of what I just said, bibliography, works cited, footnotes, or endnotes, then as far as you know, this person just sat down and started typing and writing, and they expect you to believe them just because they're saying it, just because of who they are. And most of the time, what you want is to find out where they got their information so you can go back and check all of that, to cross-reference it. So you can go back to their sources and see if they used their sources correctly, if they misquoted their sources, right? So it's important that a work has bibliography, footnotes, works cited, or endnotes. Very few people can get away with just writing a book and expecting you to believe what they say on their own authority. The people who do that are usually already well-established scholars in the field. So they've got the right education, they've already published quite a bit, they have a reputation, and so they can write things and people will just listen to them because they are who they are. But that's very rare. And if you're in prison, that's not you. That's not me either. I don't expect people to just trust everything I say because of who I am and my accomplishments. So it's really important that they have a bibliography, a works cited, because that lets you know where they got some of their information and you can track it down. So this is there was a story that happened when I was in prison. A guy had spent a bunch of time in SEG. So the hole or isolation, whatever you call it in other states, he, 23 hours a day, he was locked up for several years for gangbanging in one of the prison gangs. And he gets converted to Christianity while he's back there in SEG. Somebody comes through the prison, an evangelist or whatever, talks to him about Jesus, and he gets saved. Well, the information that this person gave him was a book by something called the Word of Faith movement. And so this is like Kenneth Copeland. And so this guy would read this information, and I don't know about today, but 10, 20 years ago, the Kenneth Copeland Ministries was just flooded the prison, right? So some of you are listening to this, you're already getting uncomfortable because you've been reading that stuff for years, or your chaplain's passing it out, the Daily Bread or whatever. And so the Kenneth Copeland Ministries were like, he was in SEG and he had just stacks of these books that the Kenneth Copeland Ministries would send people. So when I meet him, I don't agree with most of the stuff that's being promoted in the Word of Faith movement or the Kenneth Copeland stuff. And so he was getting mad, like he was still like immature, like where he'll fist fight you over, stuff that he believed about the Bible or whatever. So I had to give him a book I just happened to have. I just happened to have a book called Christianity in Crisis by Hank Hanegraaff, I think was his name. And he wrote this book in response to the Word of Faith movement. Now, before I go on, I just want you to know, if you're Muslim, atheist, or agnostic, I'm not talking about this because I'm trying to encourage people to become Christian or whatever. I'm just making a point that here was a person who had been in SEG, and the only books that he had to read to help him understand, like the Bible and his faith, were from one type of ministry group. He had no access to anything else. So he comes out. I disagree with a lot of things he says. And so I said, here's a book that you can read. And the book by Hank Hanegraaff, he actually cited all of the books that this guy had in SEG with him. So this guy might not believe me, right? Because, I'm just a youngin', or I ain't been down as long as him, and I wouldn't gangbang. So, I don't know what I'm talking about. So I said, okay, fine. You know what? Read this book, because this one cites all of the books you have. And since you have them, you can go back and you can cross-reference them. So you can hold the book by Hank Hanegraaff right here. And then when he refers to some book you have, he'll give you the name of the book and the page number. And since you already have it, you can go get it, open it up, look at the page number. And then you can say whether this guy is telling the truth or not. And after a couple of months, he basically came back to me and said, you're right. I read this book. I compared it with all the literature that I had. You're right. This stuff is maybe kind of leading people astray. So the way that happened was because he took seriously research. He looked at a book that cited all its sources. He went back to those sources to check if this guy, was saying something reliable. It turned out that he was. It's important that you have a book that tells you where they got their information, because that way you can go back if you want to, if you have the ability, and cross-reference it and make sure it's citing people accurately. If people are not citing others accurately, that's called plagiarism. And I'll have a whole discussion on something like plagiarism as well.